The Capitol is taken over by a horde of fanatical Trump supporters. Yesterday was a particularly ugly scene in American history, one that we will never forget. And on our minds, something that I've been thinking about personally, I'm sure you have as well, is this idea of social unrest and civil disobedience. Is there ever a time that it is appropriate? And if so, when? What does the Torah have to say about that? And maybe even more importantly, how do we ever know that we can really trust ourselves and our own judgment? After all, the people who stormed the Capitol yesterday didn't see themselves as a bunch of hairy, scary villains. They saw themselves as heroes and as patriots. That's the question I want to tackle with you this week. And it's a great week to tackle it because in this week's Parsha, Parshat Shemot, we have the first recorded incident in history of civil disobedience. Pharaoh commands the midwives of the Israelites, Shiphrah and Puah, kill the baby boys upon their birth. But the text tells us that these women did not listen to the command of their Pharaoh, and they kept the baby boys alive, and God rewards them. And that may not seem historic in your eyes, but recognize that that was revolutionary then, and it's revolutionary now, that the Torah is teaching us that within the institutions of power, there is a hierarchy. Yes, the government has power, but there is something that is greater than the government, and that is God and God's will, God's morality. This is what Shiphrah and Puah intuitively understood. This flew in the face of ancient religious thinking and mythology, which always propped up the existing power structures. And here the Torah is tearing them down right from their roots. And this line of thinking, don't think it was only ancient. In the Middle Ages, kings operated under a philosophy of the divine right of kings, essentially proclaiming that they were God's emissaries on earth, and therefore anything that they said or did, any laws that they enacted, were ipso facto moral and just an expression of God's will on earth, and therefore to act against the king was to be a heretic. It wasn't until the 17th century that we find thinkers like John Locke introducing concepts like personal liberty, the social contract, and human rights. And in the 19th century, thinkers like Henry David Thoreau in his essay Civil Disobedience, which introduces and catches fire this philosophy that if the government imposes laws which are immoral, it is our duty to rebel, and it's our duty to not oblige the government with our volition. We should fight against immoral laws, and it's the moral thing to do. But 3,000 years before John Locke, Henry David Thoreau, we have the real trailblazers, Shiphrah and Puah, who set forth the path of righteous civil disobedience. So what's clear is that absolutely the Torah sanctions there are times and places where it is appropriate, named moral, to be civilly disobedient. But there is a second factor we always have to operate within, and that is we have to make sure that we are aware of the reality in front of our eyes, that the reality in front of us matches the reality that we imagine in our heads. And so, for example, it's a wonderful thing to rail against injustice. But if the place, if the source of your anger is actually a government that is acting justly, then your anger is misplaced, and your act, which you see as righteous, is actually evil. Look at yesterday. I could imagine that many of the motivations of the rioters, I would hope at least, could be construed on a basic level as noble. They care about accurate elections. They care about squashing corruption. I think those are things we all agree with. The problem was they had the right motives, perhaps, but they were so misguided in their information and their understanding of reality. They were operating from a place of misinformation. When the vice president says Joe Biden has won, when Republican-appointed electoral officials and federal judges confirm the election results as accurate, when the president urges the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger from Georgia, to find the missing votes so that he can win Georgia, and the Secretary of State replies back respectfully, President Trump, what you're saying is not true, and the data you have is wrong. When we understand all of that, we know that the only way to think that this election was rigged and to feel that this is an appropriate place to vent your rage is to somehow believe that there is some colossal conspiracy from within the Republican Party to destroy the Republican Party from within. And of course, we know that that's outrageous. And so, folks, we have 2 steps if we want to make sure that when we are disobedient and when we do fight against the government, that we are doing so from a place of propriety and righteousness. The first thing is we have to study Torah very well to make sure that our morality is on point. You can't just assume you're going to be moral by following your own moral compass. You've got to learn and study what is God's law, what are God's expectations. And then the second thing is we have to be informed citizens. We have to understand the reality in front of us to make sure that when we are acting based on our morality, that it's placed in the appropriate time and place, and then we can rest assured that we are acting righteously, and we can feel comfortable in the way that we live our lives. Unfortunately, terrible acts throughout history have been committed in the mistaken belief that they were in fact good. That's why you have to study Torah, to make sure you know how to distinguish righteousness from evil. And also wonderful intentions, even wonderful intentions which are backed by Torah ideas, those have also turned ugly and evil when they're misplaced and misdirected and misguided. And so to act righteously, we need to both be well educated about morality, and we also have to be well educated about reality. I'm Rabbi Yogi Robkin from Data of Plano.